Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. I want to continue a little bit on the issue that I talked about last program. I talked about the contextualizing of history. And I think it's important that we do that. And while on the last program I talked about specific events and who was the president when this occurred or when that occurred, we have experienced things that are not just events. Oftentimes they are policies that have extended for, in some cases, 100 or hundreds of years. And that's what I want to talk about. Specifically, I'm going to talk about residential schools, but more generally, I want to talk about assimilation policy, assimilation programs. Because while I've mentioned on previous shows, there are, policies that include extermination and removal, assimilation, termination, and self-determination. There are all these policies that the United States claims to have had during different periods of time. Assimilation still stands as a policy that has been the most pervasive. In fact, in 1819, and now that's over 200 years ago, the U.S. passed the Civilization Fund Act. And this was, again, this is still the founding fathers of the United States that were starting to move away from just the idea of killing Native people and educating us to be like them. And in doing so, like Thomas Jefferson, says in his 1803 letter to William Henry Harrison, we can actually get their land from them just by making them more like us, by running them in debt, and by circumscribing them with culture and the type of livelihood, all of that stuff. And that's what the Civilization Fund Act was all about. It was about driving Native people to assimilate, not just in terms of language and culture, but in terms of livelihood. Push farming and other white livelihoods upon Native people. And in doing so, even changed the way that we did things like agriculture. Culturally, as Haudenosaunee, the women played a big role in the idea of food preparation and food management and developing that supply and that inventory. That also wasn't consistent with the way white people and the way Europeans did things. So the whole idea was to push women into things like that were more domestic, like spinning and sewing and these domestic kinds of activities. Take them out of the fields and put the men in the fields. Have the men do the agriculture. And in fact, the way that farming was being pushed on Native people was about the plow, which required a man's strength rather than the kind of farming mound farming that Native women and Native people participated in. So this concept of assimilation was geared towards how we would sustain ourselves. And of course, that played into the benefit of Americans, because the more you could push people away from things like hunting and gathering and the kinds of sustenance that required larger land holdings, the easier it was to divorce us from our lands. But what happened in 1819, and again, just because of what I did the last show, that's under President James Monroe, was the beginning of really trying to change our children. And so while residential schools wouldn't really become the thing for another 50 years or so, that's when the idea of educating and assimilating Native children would actually begin. So while residential schools may not have began immediately after 1819, after this Civilization Fund Act, education and promoting English speaking to our children and the discouragement of our culture began, had already begun, but it became more of a policy. Assimilation essentially became a national policy of the United States in 1819. Now, according to, if you Google residential schools, what you'll see is that they say residential schools began in 1860 and they ran until as late as 1973, the mid 1970s. In some cases, and Canada, all the way to 1990. But it's not that simple, because by definition, what they're calling residential schools are oftentimes federally funded schools. Even here in Seneca Territory, the Thomas Indian School was not begun by the feds. It wasn't part of a Bureau of Indian Affairs effort. It was initiated almost privately as an orphanage, and it was actually called. Let me see what. Let's see if I can find the name of it here. I had written it down someplace. It was actually considered the Thomas Asylum for Orphan and Destitute Indian Children. And in fact, many Native kids or Native people to this day still refer to the Thomas Indian School as Salem, which is kind of a bastardizing of the word asylum. But it was started as a private enterprise, and then the state did get involved in funding it. And actually, they brought in an architect to design what we see today that still remains of the Thomas Indian School. But that wasn't a federal program. So this is what was already happening. Churches were already having their inroads into educating our Native children, beginning school. So even before the residential school, policy would become, such a national thing, it was already beginning. And part of it was getting its funding from this Civilization Fund Act. But I think what's important, and the reason I want to contextualize this thing is so people understand that this is over 200 years ago that this starts. And when you consider that you have a 200-year period of a policy that, although it evolves, you have to understand, well, so who was making these decisions? So in the 1860s, when residential schools really get their start, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln through much of that. And again, I've talked about Abraham Lincoln as it relates to the Mankato, Minnesota execution of the Dakota 38 and the Sand Creek Massacre. But residential schools, this idea of federally funded, church-run residential schools, would again begin during the Abraham Lincoln's watch. I mean, actually, the first one would actually open up prior to him. I think it's under James Buchanan or something like that. But we don't consider that while massacres are still happening, including Sand Creek, including Wounded Knee, there was already this idea of kidnapping and capturing our children and sending them off to schools, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of miles away from their home. And this would continue, and it would evolve into such a level of abuse. I maintain, and I've said it before, that you can track some of the clergy sex abuse that is been in all the news over the last decade to some of the sexual abuse that took place at these residential schools. I mean, consider the fact that children literally were being given to these schools and to these church-run institutions. These churches had power of attorney over them, and when I say that, and they could make decisions about what was going to happen to them medically. They could make decisions. In fact, they were even entitled in some of these cases where some of these kids did have some financial like annuities and that kind of stuff coming. The churches could actually claim them and use those funds. So, I mean, these churches literally had absolute power of attorney over these Native kids. The parents had none. It was stripped away. So I think to really kind of talk about this issue in the way that I think we need to frame it is understanding how this policy would be adopted, its effectiveness, and again, what in the world was happening? What in the world was happening while this was happening? I mean, I can't say that the residential schools destroyed our people, because in many ways, while we still bear the historical trauma of residential schools, there's almost there's almost a hardening of what took place to Native people to survive those residential schools that carried us and that carries us today. Now, I'm not going to sit here and suggest that we were better for them, not by a long shot. But I think when a people, even when an individual experiences trauma, there is a takeaway from it, both negative and sometimes a positive from it. And and that positive can be a little tricky, because the idea of hardening a people really undermines our ability to nurture as parents, as grandparents. It broke down the whole family relationship, both the bonds that exist between sisters and the female line, and the role that uncles and the male lines played with children. In fact, the whole idea of creating these I want to call them ceremonies, I guess, but the practice of rites of passage, for girls and men, that disappeared. For girls and boys, I should say, that disappeared. That was wiped out. And in fact, there's an effort today to rekindle some of those rites of passages and the ceremonies and the training and all that stuff that goes with it, because that was wiped out by residential schools. I think it's important to, again, running through some of the numbers. It was the 1960s that was when the largest number of Native kids were enrolled in these schools. In fact, during the 1960s, the number doubled. By the time you get to 1973, there's over 60,000 kids in these schools. So again, let's think about this historically. So while Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, the Kennedys, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, when these guys are making all this news and this sensation over civil rights, Native kids are still being ripped from their homes at the highest levels in the history of the United States. It's almost mind-boggling when you put it into historical context. And I think that's why this is so important. It is so important that we realize that, these heroes of civil rights, Johnson, Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy, all of these, these historical figures. And while things are changing in the world, the United States policy of forced assimilation just continue to rage on. And let's be clear about some of what's happening here. Yes, there's a scientific interest in Native people. Look, I think the Smithsonian still has probably hundreds of Native skulls that they had gathered for study. I mean, by the little six, the +2 from the Dakota 38 +2, those two bodies were scavenged from their coffins and hauled off to Thomas Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia to study them. The residential schools were used in the same way. Look, there was disease was allowed to run rampant through it. By some estimates, the mortality rate was in excess of 50% in many of these schools because of tuberculosis. Look, they had established policies and protocols on how to deal with infection in schools and dormitories and colleges, all that stuff. Didn't apply any of it to Native people. Let's see what happens. There were the use of sterilization, and there's a lot of study that came out. And in fact, in 72 or 73, when AIM and others took over the Interior Department, they busted out some of those records associated with sterilization. But the bulk of that sterilization took place at the hands of these residential schools and the churches that ran them. I mean, part of their clinic or their medical treatment involved thorough checks of young girls' private parts. And part of it is they wanted to determine whether the virginity was still in place, intact, or not. And of course, there were surgeries, there were sterilizations that were done. And this is happening while the rest of the world is condemning this thing, these kinds of practices elsewhere. Now, don't get me wrong. When I say elsewhere, much of what Native people were experiencing during this period of time was the same thing that Black people in Africa and Aborigines in New Zealand and Australia were experiencing, Native people in South America were experiencing. So there was this level of racism that existed for indigenous populations was pretty rampant, throughout the world. I mean, I always feel remiss if I don't talk about what Hawaii was experiencing as they let white people, live and reside, and even by many accounts be regarded as Hawaiian subjects in the Kingdom of Hawaii. But this difference and this racism was leading to what all Native peoples were experiencing throughout the world at the hands of white people primarily. I know I get called out for sounding too racist sometimes, but it is what it is. And in fact, you would see folks like Adolf Hitler model what his treatment of Jews and the Moors and what the gypsy class and that kind of stuff after what the United States did, not only to Native people on battlefields, but what they did to them as they held them as captives, whether it was captive children in these residential schools. I mean, keep in mind, residential schools had already existed for, 80, 90 years by the time World War II breaks out. So when Hitler is doing, these heinous acts to Jews, the United States has been doing it for close to 100 years already. So, and I'm talking about residential schools. I'm talking about what children are experiencing. And of course, the United States also knows at this time that by breaking that bond, that cultural bond, the language, I mean, they literally believed, and this was pretty well documented, that destroying our language and destroying our cultural connection would solve the Indian problem. And to a large extent, there's some truth to that. I mean, by cutting some of that, it was easier for a lot of these assimilation programs to go further than language and culture. And look, I mean, I can, demonstrate from my own experience as the first generation not to, in my family or from my community to not have been taught the language. They didn't do that without having been influenced by these assimilation programs, by what they experienced through residential schools. It was their way of trying to protect another generation from the abuse that would come. So, I mean, as we talk about putting history into context, I think it's really, really important that we don't look at, and I said this in the last program, that we don't look at our experience in a vacuum. We have to acknowledge that the true hypocrisy associated with what we experience, not just in massacres and land removal, but in residential schools, in their forced assimilation programs, the true hypocrisy is what was happening in the rest of the world. In 1913, the rest of the world was already regarding this notion of denationalization, the idea of stripping away somebody's culture and national character and implanting another in its place. The rest of the world was already beginning to call that a war crime. while they ignored what the United States was doing to Native people and Native children in particular. The definition of genocide includes the removal of our children. It includes the idea of creating the conditions that a people would cease to exist. Residential schools qualified on many levels for a definition of genocide. And yet, look, on the Canadian side, and look, and I don't want to be overly critical of Murray Sinclair, who was one of the guys who oversaw the Truth and Reconciliation process. But when I hear a Native person say the residential schools represented cultural genocide, I said, cultural? You just put a word in front of genocide because somehow genocide by itself was inaccurate? No, putting the word cultural in front of the word genocide is what was inaccurate. Genocide is defined as taking children. It's not just about killing people, but if you commit things like sterilization, that's part of the definition of genocide. So when I see what history is putting out there in terms of the definition of genocide, and understanding that residential schools not only meet that definition, but it was ignored by the international community for, again, genocide. These residential schools existed for over 100 years. The policies that would begin genocide was over 200 years ago. And we still today are experiencing some of those same conditions. So how did residential schools end? Well, I mean, they would begin during Lincoln and Buchanan, but they would end during Nixon, supposedly. But they wouldn't really end there, because we still had Native kids being, grabbed up in the U.S. and Canada during the 60s and the 70s scoop, where kids were being forced into foster care and put up for adoption. And when they passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, it did have an effect at stopping some of that, but not completely. In fact, one of the biggest workarounds when it came to the Indian Child Welfare Act and adoptions was to have Americans adopt Native kids from Canada and Canadians adopt Native kids from the U.S. That whole border thing became a loophole around it. And beyond the adoption was just plain foster care, which always was run not by Native people. I mean, most Native people couldn't even qualify to be foster parents through most of this era. So assimilation was inherent in much the same way that it was with residential schools. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't cite the slogan that was established for the Carlisle Indian School: "Kill the Indian, save the man." In fact, Pratt, who ran these things, who was a Civil War general or something, I don't know, he would cite the Shivington quote, the Sheridan quote about the only good Indian's a dead Indian, and was using that line to justify the idea of killing the Indian within children. I mean, he hung on that phrase, and that's where "kill the Indian, save the man" comes from. It doesn't come out of it's not out of a vacuum. It's out of the agreement that most politicians and military people held, that Native people were better off dead than living as Native people. So that's why you develop an assimilation program. It's crazy because, the idea that there was a bicentennial for this Civilization Fund Act that I missed a couple of years ago. I mean, who knew? I didn't even know. As I'm looking back in history and I'm trying to contextualize what our experience has been, more things come out. More things, are displayed to me. So that's what I'm encouraging you as the listeners to this podcast, as the viewers of these videos. You don't have to wait for me to deliver this stuff. We can look at your own family's history. And when and where trauma existed, Understand what was happening in the rest of the world, what was happening in the United States, what was happening in this state or that state. Make sure that you put some context to what has happened to our people and what's happening today. Look, you cannot look at the rest of the world and see social unrest and not feel some connection to the social unrest that's happening in, whether it's in Asia or the Middle East or in Russia or wherever, France, South America, and not put it into the context of our own experiences, and what ultimately is our shared experiences. We need to understand that much of this stuff has happened while people were being touted as heroes and as champions of human rights in the United States and elsewhere. Again, it's easy for me to cite what took place during Lincoln's presidency or Jefferson's or some of these other more famed historical leaders. But we can go right down the line. That's why I think this expression "run the Gaius" is so important when we use it, to describe the president of the United States. I think we need to understand that even the most short-lived presidents, William Henry Harrison, had a track record. He only served for a month as the president before he died. But he had a track record already because of the relationship with Thomas Jefferson on what they would do to eliminate us. And the deviousness associated with the idea that they would cultivate affection from us so they could screw us out of our land. I just think it is so important to put this stuff in context because, look, as we go through life as Native people and we hear these people who are propped up as American heroes, we need to know the balance to that. We need to know the other side of that coin. We need to know that, yes, you might be propping up George Washington as the father of your country, but he also clearly established terrorism as an acceptable strategy to be employed against the Haudenosaunee, Senecas in particular. We need to know that. And we need to know that because not only do we have to balance the myths of their historical figures, but we have to bring all of that forward. I mean, some people say, what difference does it make, what happened 200 years ago? Well, assimilation programs started 200 years ago, and we're still in the throes of that. We are still very much experiencing the effects of policies today, and everything from what we're taught in school. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that during this entire time that residential schools are existing is when non-Native schools adopted this idea of using Native people for mascots. So while our kids were stripped, their hair cut, their names changed, their clothing taken, and every aspect of their Native identity is being ripped away as a national policy of the United States. High schools, grade schools, sports clubs, including what would be professional sports teams, are using Native people for their mascots, for their amusement and entertainment, mocking who we are, recreating for their own purposes what a Native person was, so they can call themselves Redskins and Indians and warriors and savages and raiders and all these other things. All the while, the national policy, and when I say national, I mean right down to every individual state, was geared towards stripping Native people of the very identity that white people were claiming with their use of mascots. So when you ask, why am I so passionate about that issue, among all the other issues that Native people face, it's the pure hypocrisy that the mascot issue represents, set against the real life history of our people. The very history that those who claim to use these mascots suggest they are honoring with them. So that's why we need to contextualize history. I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.